Start talking. Hey.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, world.
Hello, world, yes.
Calling Chris Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London. Calling
Okay.
Rick Beyer in Chicago.
Okay, Rick Beyer in Chicago here. Chris, happy to see you. How you doing?
I'm thrilled. Arsenal won today, so all is well with the world.
Excellent. We're glad that you're happy.
Thank you.
We're going to welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, and we're going to wait a moment for people to join us so that we can get started. Please let us know where you're coming from, and especially if you're coming from Canada, because that's our topic today. And I see John's there from Toronto, so that's fabulous. And we're here every Saturday, every Sunday, whatever day of the week this is.
You're on top of it, Rick.
I am having a great day so far. Well, Arsenal's victory has confused me a little bit.
I know. It confuses me, too. It doesn't
We're
happen.
celebrating St. Patrick's Day week here in Chicago, so it's always a little bit off. But we're here every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours Facebook and YouTube pages. So please join us. And if you want to get an email, by the way, each week telling you what's up with the show, you can just email us and we'll put you on that email list. We promise you won't get any other emails. And our email is hhh@stephenambrosetours.com. So Chris, who's joining? Who are our guests? I mean, who are our audience? Who's with us?
Oh, well, George Luz, of course.
George Luz
Jr.
Okay.
Jim Latin. John Matthew, as you say, from Canada, so we're happy about that. Gene Templin, stalwart here.
Hey, we see Doreen and Wally and Duncan, Lizzie, and Valerie from Normandy. Greetings from Normandy. Bienvenue,
Bienvenue.
History, happy le. My French is fairly poor. So, okay. Maybe that's a sign, Chris, that we should stop killing time and start doing something. So
I think so.
Why don't you give me the signal?
The bar is open.
The bar is open, and Mr. Anderson, you have the floor here.
I do, huh? Well, I just for those of you who have traveled with me before, you know I get slightly excited when I get to talk about Canada and World War II and Canadian military history. So I'm really very, very excited about this week's show. We have Dr. Tim Cook on this week. Dr. Cook has written 12 books on Canadian military history. He is a historian at the Canadian War Museum, which is going to be one of the coolest jobs ever. And he, amongst his many awards, is the Pierre Berton Award for Canadian History. He's a member of the Royal Society of Canada and the Order of Canada. And although he doesn't know it, one of his biggest awards is the fact that I use his books all the time when I get ready for my World War I tour. But this week we're going to be talking about his new book, The Fight for History, about Canada in World War II and Canada's memory of the war and how it handles that memory.
Oh, and Tim, one of your biggest awards is that you were invited on History Happy.
Well, yeah, that goes without saying.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, it's great to be with you, and nice to spend a Sunday here in Ottawa, where we're coming out of winter right now. And thrilled to be here and to talk about Canada and the Second World War and the memory of that over the last 75 years. Of course, last year, 2020, was the 75th anniversary when my book dropped, and interrupted by COVID, of course. But this stuff matters. It doesn't just matter one year; it matters every year and every month, every week, and every day.
Absolutely.
And I just, before Chris gets into questioning you here, I'm afraid we actually didn't warn you. We did not warn you, so it's okay. I know you're going to be unprepared, but this is History Happy Hour. So we do have cocktails with us, and I just do need Chris to ask you what you're drinking today.
You just asked him.
Tim,
what are you drinking today?
No, Chris, I'm asking you what you're drinking. Because having not warned Tim, he may not be drinking anything.
Well, I'm having fortified coffee.
Oh, wow.
In my dad's army mug.
That is almost a first here. I guess that's the Arsenal victory telling.
It is.
But Chris, I know Tim, we forgot to warn you. So that's a fair.
That's all right, guys. One of my very first articles, if you permit me, when I was a young academic, was on the importance of battle rum in the trenches in the Great War. And I was reading letters and diaries and memoirs, as so many of us do when we're trying to understand that experience of combat. And in the Great War, I kept coming across rum. Now, I was doing my first book on gas warfare, so I was looking for that three-letter word gas. But I kept finding rum, and it was, you know, the issuing of rum, the importance of rum, standing in the mud with the lice, you know, and the guys would get their shot of rum in the morning and at night, the stand to and stand down. And it was so crucial to them. And I thought, isn't this a fascinating story? Because no one had really written about this in Canada. Really part of the social history of soldiers, how they coped, how they endured. And it went beyond that. Of course, if you went out on a dangerous raid or a patrol, you got a double shot of rum. There was a reward system here. You know, officers kept the rum from the guys who were in the clink or who were being punished, right? So rum was this really interesting tool for motivation, command and control, and also part of the culture, right? Think of all those songs around drinking when a bit of the alcohol loosened up the throat. So I think it's entirely appropriate that you have started your show with a drink.
And the next time we invite you on, you'll have been warned. We apologize for that. So there you go.
Okay. Well, so Tim, as I'm sure you are aware, and I know I am aware, Americans, and for that matter, Brits are woefully unaware of the fact that they had this other ally that made a major contribution to the war. And since our audience is largely American and British, could you just give us a sense of what Canada's contribution to this was, why it was such an important ally?
Yeah, of course, Canada had about 1.1 million Canadians in uniform. That was from a country of about 11 million. So 1 in 10 Canadians served. And it was service both in Canada and defending North America with the United States. Canada entered the war on the 10th of September, 1939, so about a week after Britain went to war. That was different than in the Great War. When Britain went to war on the 4th of August, 1914, Canada as a dominion was automatically at war. In the 25 years since then, Canada, things had changed, and it was Canada that declared war. But really, it was almost a foregone conclusion. English Canada, which made up about 2/3 of the country, demanded that the government stand by Britain and France in this war that everyone had seen coming for several months. And yet Canada was deeply unprepared for the conflict. It had a prime minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, best known to Canadians, if known at all, for being a spiritualist, for talking to his dead mother and his dead dog through seances. But one of the big three, as we see there, or like to see himself as part of the big three. Of course, he was the fourth wheel, if the other third is Stalin. In addition to Roosevelt and Churchill there. But King understood that Canada was not a great power, but Canada would play its part. And it did. It had over 750,000 soldiers who served in the army, fighting around the world, about 250,000 Canadians in the RCAF, our Air Force, in Bomber Command and Fighter Command, and about 100,000 Canadians in the Royal Canadian Navy, who played that absolutely crucial role in keeping the Battle of the Atlantic, those channels open for North American war supplies and food and personnel to make it to Britain. So Canada's contribution was significant, fighting around the world in the Far East, in Hong Kong, in Burma, about 100,000 soldiers serving in the Sicily campaign and in Italy. And then the bulk of the fighting on land from D-Day on the 6th of June, 1944, which I probably don't have to remind your listeners here, although in Canada I often do, fighting through France, the absolutely crucial and brutal battles of June, July, August, and then clearing the Channel ports, maybe the most important Canadian land campaign, the Scheldt campaign. And then the liberation of the Dutch and the final battles into Germany. So a significant contribution, of which Canada paid us a high price in lives, about 45,000 killed, 55,000 wounded.
Wow.
Well,
Did you?
and I was just going to say, tell us a little bit more about the North Atlantic, because I think that is probably the biggest surprise. Maybe it's the biggest surprise for me in looking into this. I always think of run silent, run deep, and the American destroyers are battling the German U-boats, but the Canadians are out there with these with the corvettes and everything that they're doing, and they are really essentially protecting America so that the U.S. Navy can be elsewhere.
Yeah, it's a key role for Canada, which from the start of the war, we had, well, maybe backtrack. Before the war, we had purchased 4 modern destroyers, which helped to augment our the Royal Canadian Navy. And from 1939, it was engaged in helping merchant ships cross the Atlantic, solidifying in the more formal convoys of 1940 and 41. And of course, the threat was against the German U-boats that were seeking to sever that crucial lifeline from North America to Britain. And when the United States enters the war in December of 1941, it of course is engaged in a 2-front war, and increasingly the Navy was pulled away into the Pacific campaign there. And when the U-boats crossed the Atlantic again in 1942, they hunted up and down the East Coast. They made their way into the heart of Canada, down the St. Lawrence. They sunk about 20 ships. But the Canadians were able to drive them out. And by driving them out, they then hunted down, again, as I said, the East Coast there, wreaking havoc. And so the Royal Canadian Navy was involved in helping to defend the United States, helping in the Caribbean to make sure that oil could be moved along those seaways. And it's just one of the stories, I think, of Canada and the United States, which really isn't well known, I think, in the United States or in Canada, about the incredible role that Canada and the United States played in defending North America with integrated command and control systems, with defense boards being created, which are still to this day, some of those legacies of the Second World War are absolutely profound. And one of the most significant ones is that Canada and the United States were very much drawn together through defense industry and through the defense of the realm, as we might call it, and that will continue in the post-war years.
Well, I mean, one of the things that you notice as you start to look at this is when we talk about the arsenal of democracy, Canada makes major contributions, not just militarily, but also in terms of industry, helping to build these armaments, and also feeding Britain. I mean, that's so.
Canada was an agricultural power. It still is, of course. It's an enormous country. We have vast wheat fields, and in both the First World War and the Second World War, while historians like myself have often tended to focus on the fighting forces in the First World War along the Western Front, in the Second World War on the various theaters of war, we were a crucial agricultural agrarian power, and that, as you mentioned, it really helps to keep Britain in the war, along with there are some interesting statistics producing, top of my head, more than 4 billion rounds of ammunition, millions of rifles, 16,000 aircraft, if I remember correctly, warships. I think we built about 400 warships during the course of the war. There was the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan that had British and Commonwealth and even American airmen come to Canada and to be trained up. In the end, 131,000 airmen were trained up for the air war that would follow. And so these are just some of the home front stories or home front contributions that Canada was a part of, and I think contributed to the significant Allied victory.
So then why do you think it is, Tim, that, obviously before America gets involved in the war, particularly, Britain needs Canada. It is crucial. Why do you think Mackenzie King isn't more assertive in making sure that there's a fourth chair at the table during all this? Right?
Well, I wrote a book on William Lyon Mackenzie King as well, called Warlords, and he's a really interesting character, peculiar man, a sad man, He was a bachelor his whole life, very bright, educated in the United States, Canada's longest-serving prime minister, I think 22 years, and yet extremely cautious through his political career. Always in the center, happy to lead from the rear, not an inspiring man. In fact, Canadians often turn to Roosevelt and Churchill as their war leaders to inspire them. And so Mackenzie King was always very cautious about one thing, and that one thing was conscription. In the Great War, Canada had brought in conscription in 1917, had been an utterly divisive event, pitting English against French, but those in the farms against those in the cities, organized labor against those who owned the businesses. And it really tore the country apart. And Mackenzie King was desperate not to repeat that. And so there really was no grand Canadian strategy except not to have to revert to conscription. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, as we've already said, that Canada wasn't involved in the war in significant ways and fighting. But Mackenzie King, it wasn't as important for him to be as part of the strategic direction of the war. And just to give you one example that I talk about in my book, Warlords, Mackenzie King didn't even know when D-Day would be launched. In fact, in the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, he's woken up by one of his servants saying, "The invasion has begun," and they scramble to put together a speech. So really kind of an incredible story there. And I think that ties a little bit into my book, The Fight for History. I mean, this is not my first book. You've mentioned it's my 12th, and it's my third book in my series on the Second World War. The first book was called The Necessary War, and the second book was called Fight to the Finish. And I thought that was it. I wrote 2 volumes. They're big books. They're 500 pages each. But when I was touring across Canada and speaking about those books, I heard 2 things from people. One was thank you. You know, thanks for putting in the time and the effort. It's not easy to write books like this, and people appreciate. I have a style of writing that is quite literary. I'm an academic historian, but I've always believed in the importance of let's tell a good story here. Let's make sure that people, they want their history, but it's up to us to give them good history. And I try to do that with my books. But when I was touring the country, people said 2 things to me. One, geez, you know, I grew up reading American history and British history, and gosh, I love German history. I love the Eastern Front, and I love the Pacific Campaign, and I read a book about the Italian campaign once. But like so often, people said, I just didn't know that Canada's contributions were so significant. No idea there were 1.1 million Canadians in uniform. No idea that Canadians were involved here or there. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? I'm not a normal Canadian. I've spent 25 years writing about military history. Chris, you mentioned I work at the War Museum. It's an incredible job. Yeah. I meet Canadians every day who are interested in their history. But a lot of people don't know these stories. And the second part, you know, ties into that, which is the silences. And most people said to me, you know, my dad or my grandfather or my great uncle or my great aunt, they served. But you know what? They never talked about the war. There was always a silence there. There was always a gap. And I heard that so often, and I began to think about that. Why was there a silence? You know, the veterans didn't feel that they could talk about the war. We as Canadians, I argue in my book, didn't give them the space to talk about the war. I think we have a greater sense of things like post-traumatic stress disorder today. All of these things, and yet that really pushed me to write this third book, The Fight for History. Mm-hmm. And I see it as a fight against forgetting, a fight against apathy, and a fight to do better.
Right.
You know, one of the chapters in your book has the title, Portraying Ourselves Continuously as Losers, which is a fairly pointed and direct chapter title, and you know, I think it's pretty clear what you're getting at. But can you expand on that a little bit? I mean, I think that probably for a lot of people, what they know about Canada's participation in World War II may be the Dieppe raid and what a terrible disaster it was. But take us a little deeper into that thought.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Rick. To do that, I have to step back a little bit, I think, and think about when the veterans came home. And that's really the start of my book, is what kind of Canada would they return to? After the Great War, the veterans came back, and there were very few programs for them. They were almost abandoned. The country was in tremendous debt. A generation later, their fathers, their uncles who were in the Legion fought for greater veterans' rights. And we had what was called the Veterans Charter, very similar to the GI Bill in the US. And so absolutely crucial for putting veterans on a road to prosperity. And Canada was, as I mentioned before, was changed by the war. Europe is in ruins. We're more closely tied to the United States economy. And Canada emerges from the war a very different country. Comparatively wealthy, prosperous, having lost 45,000 killed, and so grieving, but yet moving forward. And one of the questions I wanted to look at is, why didn't we build the same memorials? Canada has thousands of memorials to the Great War. I'm sure you guys have done tours to Vimy Ridge. It's a very powerful place. There are other sites on the Western Front. And yet, before 2003, with the building of the Juno Beach Center, Canada just wasn't well represented overseas, and we weren't well represented in Canada. So my book looks at that, the failure of Canada to build memorials. There was a great debate in Canada to build a new national memorial in downtown Ottawa for the World War II veterans. And the government of the day, Mackenzie King's government, said, no, we're not going to do that. So we didn't build monuments. We also didn't tell stories well in our history books. We didn't create the same films or documentaries. And so I go through this where we simply left the war behind until by about the 1970s, when the next generation came. We had taught it poorly. There weren't the same memorials or films. And yet if Canadians knew one thing, they knew, as you said, Rick, about Dieppe. That was one thing that was taught in our schools and our classrooms. And isn't that strange? I mean, one day, the 19th of August, 1942, an absolute disaster. You can't turn it into anything else. Yeah, dress rehearsal, perhaps. Learning some hard lessons, maybe. There were other ways to learn those lessons and to do the rehearsals. And I talk about that in the book. And yet, by focusing on Dieppe, that defeat, it perverted, in fact, the Canadian story, as we started at the top of the hour about the incredible contributions of Canada fighting around the world, on the oceans, in the air, and yet boiled down to Dieppe. And that is a part of this strange story in Canada for the first 50 years, where we either didn't tell our story, didn't build the memorial, or we focused on a single defeat. And I found it all the more strange because Vimy is, in fact, as you know, such an important icon in Canada, such an important legend. I wrote a book on that. We have the memorial there. It's on our $20 bill. It's in our passports. Vimy is almost shorthand for how the Great War changed Canada, propelled us forward. And yet we didn't talk about World War II the same way, when we should have, because it profoundly changed the modern Canada.
Well, tell me, right from the get-go, as you trace this forgetting, I mean, it almost starts at the top. I mean, one of the quotes that really struck me was Bruce Claxton, who's the Minister of National Defense, says, well, you know, after 1948, nobody's even going to want to read about this. Yeah. And then you have C.P. Stacey, who I'd like you to kind of get into a little bit, who's supposed to write the official history of Canada's contribution.
Yeah. Yeah. Charles Stacey, we were very lucky to have Charles Stacey. I mean, C.P. Stacey was a gifted historian, but coming out of World War II, there was tremendous cutbacks. So Canada's million-strong forces were reduced down to, I forget the number, about 20,000. Almost everyone was demobilized. And as part of that were the historical sections. There were 3 small historical sections, Army, Navy, Air Force, that had produced credible works during the war to tell our story. After the war, though, Brooke Claxton and others basically said, we don't need this. We don't need to tell our story. Claxton went so far as to, when he was cutting the RCAF historical section, he said, the British will do it for us. You know, we don't need this. And of course, the Air Force senior air marshals, you know, they had other considerations. So the naval history was cut, the Air Force history was cut. Only Stacey's Army history survived, and he was able to produce a credible one-volume history in 1948, which was about the only solid historical work that was produced in the 5 years after the war. And then there was a history of the Italian campaign in the 1950s, and then the Victory campaign in 1960, which was the fighting from D-Day to the end of the war. And C.P. Stacey is regarded really as one of our finest historians, probably our leading military historian. But what's interesting about the Victory campaign, and maybe Chris, this is what you're referring to, when he was trying to sum up the judgment of the Canadians fighting in Normandy, he was quite harsh.
Yeah. And
he basically blamed the junior officers for not pushing the Canadians harder in battle. Now, you know, that's certainly, there's scholarly debate around the advance of the Allied armies. I'm sure you guys have talked about this. When you're in Normandy, of course, was Monty too slow? Should more resources have been put towards Patton? There's been fierce debate about that. What's amazing, though, is when you walk the battlefield, as I know you guys have, to see the Germans on the defensive. I mean, that is good it's good tank country, and it's good anti-tank country, we know, and we don't have to go into those discussions, except that it was a slow, painful advance. But we often forgot, of course, that it was the Canadians, the British, and the Americans in the first days of the invasion on the 7th, the 8th, the 9th of June that were holding off those counter-attacking German forces, and had they been pushed back to the beaches, they would have been annihilated. So all of this was recounted in Stacey's history, and yet his judgment was that the Canadians probably could have pushed harder, that they had inexperienced officers, and that they should have done better. And that's interesting because Stacey was an official historian, and that history itself really influenced, or at least was one of the key ways to influence the way that other historians thought about the Canadians in Normandy. Now, later in his life, I wrote a book on Stacey and the writing of Canadian military history called Cleo's Warriors. Later in life, Stacey returned to that, and he said, I was probably too hard. But he said, you know what I said about the Canadians could have been said about the British and the Americans as well. I mean, the Germans were very good at fighting on the defensive. They were particularly adept at marshaling resources, even though they had lost command of the air and other aspects. And yet, as historians have said, as I have written in my books, in the end, the Germans were defeated. I mean, they were defeated in whatever it is, 77, 78 days. It wasn't a 100-day campaign. So that, too, I mean, having an official history, which it's a 500-page history, and most of it is pretty laudatory towards the Canadians. Yeah. But just that one page is quite interesting, was often selected by other historians to say, well, you know, the Canadians were kind of slow. Look, it took them a month to take Caen. What happened at Verrier Ridge? A clear-cut defeat, no doubt. Totalized, intractable, kind of strange operations that probably should have done better. But no one ever goes beyond into the Scheldt campaign, or really 1945, where the First Canadian Army under General Harry Criar is leading 450,000 soldiers, including Americans and British and other Commonwealth troops. So it was an unfortunate, I think, conclusion that Stacey had, even though he did much to raise the profile of the Canadian Army.
I want to remind everybody that we're talking to Tim Cook here, who's the author of The Fight with History, and we're talking about remembering Canada and its participation in World War II and the fight for history, to fight to remember. We have a couple of questions from the audience, and Tim, I want to actually circle back on something we were talking about before, because somebody asked us to explain about Dieppe, because maybe not everybody knows what happened at Dieppe, and to give us the sort of the 1 minute explainer of what the Dieppe raid is all about.
Right. Well, Dieppe went in at the French town of Dieppe on the 19th of August, 1942, as part of a larger series of increasingly more sophisticated raids led by Lord Mountbatten and his combined headquarters. Dieppe has always had controversy, and some have even claimed conspiracy around it, because there was an operation that was to have been launched a month before, which was called off. There was a feeling that the Germans had been alerted to the raid, They weren't, but they were ready for an operation like it. There was a sizable force at Dieppe. The Germans never thought anyone would be crazy enough to actually attack a fortified town, and yet the British and Canadian planners did exactly that. And it was a disaster in many ways, but I would say primarily because it was contingent upon several forces coming into Dieppe, and the two beaches on the flanks at Puys and Pourville had to be captured a half hour earlier to knock off the guns on the cliffs to then allow the main force to take the beach. And if you've been there, if you've walked the Dieppe, it's incredible. You feel the weight of history there. You can look up on the cliffs and still see the machine gun emplacements. You survey this open, rocky beach, and you wonder how anyone could have got off it, and really they couldn't have. It was a disaster. About 5,000 Canadians were involved in the operation, about another 1,000 British and some American Rangers. And by the end of the day, and I suppose the casualties continue into several weeks, I think it's 900 dead, almost 2,000 captured and wounded. And it really was a shock. Now, the backstory to this, I think it's worth remembering, is that the Americans were chomping at the bit. They wanted to get into the invasion of Europe in 1942, if you can imagine, but by the very least 1943. And the British were holding off the Americans. And of course, we must remember Stalin on the Eastern Front and the Soviets, who were bearing the brunt of the war against the German Wehrmacht. And Stalin needed a second front open and had been demanding it. The bombing campaign was not sufficient in his mind, although it was growing in intensity. And so all of those factors come together to create the Dieppe raid, and it was just a complete failure.
So, Tim, I want to get into kind of the battle for memory here in a little bit, but one of the questions we've gotten from Frank Zielinski, I'll kind of put it up here if I can, that I think is a good one, is what did Churchill and Roosevelt think of King? And I'd expand that a little bit and say, do you have any thoughts about their impressions of Canada's role in all this?
Yeah, it's a good question, and thanks for that, Frank. There was a surprising friendship between Mackenzie King and FDR. They didn't know each other very well, but they got along well, and Roosevelt often confided in Mackenzie King. During the course of the war, Mackenzie King went to the United States several times. They worked out absolutely crucial deals, both in finance and war production and the defense of North America. And they could only have happened with Roosevelt making concessions. And he did it for his friend Mackenzie King. So that's really interesting. Mackenzie King, despite being a strange, sad man who had very few friends, who was often paranoid about usurpers coming to knock him off as prime minister, who kept a 50,000-page diary. Yeah, 50,000 pages, which is now available, which I have read thousands of pages in
Lucky you.
Book, and it's filled with incredible stuff. He was a man ruthless in dispatching political opponents. He would throw you under the bus before he opened the door for you, and yet he was also involved in seances. He was a numerologist, and so the face of the clock mattered to him. He saw visions. He had seances. He's a really interesting person.
That's very generous, Tim.
Yeah, and yet he and Roosevelt got along, but he and Churchill, chalk and cheese, did not like each other. Mackenzie King thought Churchill was a dangerous adventurer before the war. Mackenzie King was an appeaser, and so we know in history just how that turned out. Churchill, for his own part, thought Mackenzie King was kind of a weasel, a lifeless weasel who really had no backbone, and he really didn't like him very much. Their relationship warmed during the course of the war. Mackenzie King made a few visits to Churchill, and he was always Mackenzie King was a teetotaler, so he didn't drink. So
that's right,
again,
big strike there. Yeah.
There's one entry in one of Mackenzie King's diary where Churchill is having one of his famous parties, and Churchill's drunk something like 3 or 4 bottles of champagne on his own and is dancing around the room, and he's trying to get Mackenzie King up to dance. and Mackenzie King writes something to the effect of, "It was a very unusual evening," or something like that, you know. But you know, Churchill was happy to have Mackenzie King supplying munitions and ships and tanks and hundreds of thousands of soldiers and sailors and airmen, but not to be involved in the strategy of the war. Right. Churchill needed the Commonwealth to help balance against the overpowering and growing might of the United States. And so he always used the Commonwealth that way. But Churchill himself wasn't much interested in sharing any authority with Mackenzie King or the Australian Prime Minister or anything like that. So it was a complex relationship. And we know that Churchill, I'm a great Churchophile, as many are, you know, is incredible, you know, the greatest historian of the 20th century in the English language, and, you know, all of that great stuff. But Churchill often treated Canada like it was still a colony. And there was, during the course of the war, as I write in the book, there was an evolution of the way that Canada saw itself. You know, both the First World War and the Second World War were nationalizing moments where Canada stepped out onto the world stage, and through its contributions and through the service and sacrifice, the country was changed. And during the Second War, as we talked about before, it really does become a there was a stronger Canadian identity that emerges from that war effort, as is often the case for many countries, and passing through the trials of war.
Churchill didn't treat the United States as a colony. He just wished we still were a colony.
And some of us agree with him, but that's all right.
Well, I was going to ask Skip's question, if you think that you know, that's kind of a good one.
I will ask Skip's question.
Yeah. So Skip has a really long question. It almost covers you there, Tim, but it's about the Holocaust and what did Canada do with the information? You wrote about this some in your book in the years after the war, and also about kind of what Canada did in terms of Holocaust refugees accepted into Canada, and what kind of Holocaust education goes on in Canada.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Skip. Canada was anti-Semitic before the war. It had racial policies to keep Jewish people out. There were a number of horrendous cases, like the St. Louis, which was a ship of Jewish refugees fleeing Europe that nobody would allow into their country, not a number of Caribbean states, not the United States, not Canada. It was a shameful episode. There is absolutely no evidence to suggest that Canada went to war in September of 1939 to fight for Jewish people. No, that wasn't on the radar. Canada went to war to stand by Britain. And because it understood that the fascists had to be defeated. And so there's a little bit of element there. And there was significant reporting on the repression and oppression of Jewish people in Germany. And yet during the course of the war, thousands of Jewish Canadians served in the Canadian Armed Forces. And at the end of the war, the revelation of the death camps and the concentration camps, especially Bergen-Belsen, were a shock to Canadians. And these were reported on, and there were films in Canada about this, as there was, as Eisenhower had demanded with many of the other death camps as well. And so after the war, there was, Canada supported the creation of the State of Israel. There was more war refugees were allowed into the country who were displaced people from Europe. And yet there remained anti-Semitic feelings in Canada, I think, for many decades. It was a difficult period for Jewish people. There became large segments of Jewish Canadians in Toronto and Montreal, some of the bigger cities. And I think all of that is a part of the story of World War II. And that I think, like other scholarship around the Holocaust, that the survivors themselves often weren't able to talk about it and to share those stories until the early 1960s, and then there began to gather a momentum to both tell these difficult stories, but also to record them and archive them and make them available. There is no, and to finish off your question, there is no Holocaust Memorial Museum at the national level in Canada like there is in the United States, in Washington, or in other countries. There is a Holocaust Memorial in downtown Ottawa, right near the War Museum, and it is a significant part of the educational curriculum, I think it would be fair to say, in Canada, to the point where in the 90s, it was often the central story of World War II. And there were Canadian veterans, and I write about this in my book, who said, that's fine, that's important history to tell, but you must also tell the military history, Canada's military history. And there really was a series of unfortunate incidents that I write about in the book where you had Canadian veterans, often against those in the Jewish community, and an oppositional approach there when there probably shouldn't have been. Yeah. And I think we had to work through that. But to understand that opposition, as I write in the book, you have to understand that up to that point, the first 50 years, Canada had done a pathetic job in telling its military history. And so the veterans really felt that their history had been ignored, and they were lashing out.
So Tim, I mean, you talk quite a bit about how basically Canadians fail to tell their story, particularly after the war, and so it gets lost, and the memory of that event starts to recede. But that changes. So, what do you think the tipping point is? What is it? What is the moment when Canadians say, "Oh, wait a minute, we were there too"?
We were there too. Yeah. The tipping point for me is the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. So 1994 and 1995. And you two guys, I can see your age, you lived through that. And you remember how that was really a critical event, sort of the world, or the Western world, coming together to mark the end of the war. And anniversaries matter. We know that. I write in the book about the 40th anniversary, so 1984, where thousands of Canadian veterans went back to the Normandy landings there. And I talk about Ronald Reagan and his very powerful speech there, and the galvanizing of support, and in fact the generosity from Reagan when he talks about Canadians. And yet the Canadians were not well represented there. The Prime Minister of the day was Pierre Trudeau, who was at the end of a very long time in power. He had no desire to talk about war. He was really interested in talking about peace. And the Canadian veterans felt they had been abandoned again in 1984. And so, 10 years later, after that, the continual focus on defeat, Rick, as you talked about, and disgrace in terms of there was a powerful redress campaign in Canada for Japanese Canadians who had been forcibly relocated from the West Coast, just as there was in the United States. And that all culminated in the 1980s when that history was written back into World War II. And yet, with that becoming such a powerful focus, you had the defeat at Dieppe and now the disgrace of forced relocation of Japanese Canadians. Again, it fed into this idea that we just hadn't told we didn't tell our story. And when we did, it was about defeat and disgrace. And the veterans who went back in 1994, the Canadian veterans, there were thousands of them, really didn't expect much. I spoke to some of them, I interviewed them. They didn't think that Canada would be mentioned or there would be much memory of what the Canadians had done. And they were wrong. Things had changed, and both of our national networks were there reporting from the battlefields, first in Normandy in 1994, and then the next year in the Netherlands. And of course, the Dutch had never forgotten the Canadian liberators. There's a really strong bond there. And that changed things. There was this enormous coverage. New history books were written. There were new documentaries. There was a new sense that we had abandoned our veterans. We had not done right by them. And so there was a push from the mid-90s onwards to let veterans speak, to record their memories in great oral history projects, to try to tell our story better. There was the emergence of a new generation of military historians, of which I'm part of that. And my argument in the book, it's called 70, the subtitle is 75 Years of Forgetting, Remembering, and Remaking Canada's Second World War. And the remaking has really been over the last 25 years. And I finished the book and argued we have done a better job. There is more work that needs to be done because it's never over. The fight for history, as I said, the fight is against forgetting, it's against apathy, and it's a fight done by historians and teachers and artists and filmmakers and tour guides and students and all, right? It's not one group. It has to be a continual fight, because if you don't, failure is to forget. Failure is to turn your back on our shared history. Failure is to let the memory of World War II disappear, just as this generation is disappearing.
Well, sure, and I was going to say that that must lend a special urgency. I mean, I think it does for me in the World War stuff, and for Chris in the World War II stuff we're doing. That these guys are going. They're not going to be around. And in the Ghost Army, the unit that I have worked on, we the youngest veteran at this point I think is 97 years old. The oldest one is 106, and he's Canadian, by the way.
Okay.
So Gil Seltzer, we got you in here to the show. The Canadian
Ghost Army.
Yes. And but that must lend us. I mean, I think it lends a real urgency to this. It's not that the material dries up once the guys are gone, but people, but trying to do this while some of them are still here, while you can still tap that resource.
Yeah, I think there is a sense of urgency. It's a good word, I think, Rick. And in Canada, of the 1.1 million who enlisted, of course, 45,000 died during the war, immediately afterwards. But we're down to 22,000. And every day you can open up a paper and see an obituary in there. And at the War Museum, where I'm very lucky to work, we've had an oral history project for 20 years where we've interviewed veterans, and not just World War II, Korean War, Cold War veterans, more recently veterans of the Afghanistan conflict and war. We have to work at this. And that's really, I guess I didn't, when I was writing the book, I didn't set off to be for it to be a call to action, although it became that. And there were parts of the book where I was quite angry about the way we had failed to tell our story. And it's not always a case of the British and the Americans pushing the Canadians out of the way. Often, as I write in the book, this was a self-inflicted wound. We in Canada didn't do the hard lifting. We didn't fight for our history. We didn't produce the same films and documentaries and write the same novels and plays. We didn't build the memorials. It's a self-inflicted wound. And this has resonated with Canadians. The book is a national bestseller. Get a lot of emails from people, not from veterans now, although I did get an email from a 99-year-old veteran a couple of months ago, which I treasured, but from the children of veterans. And they're often anywhere between 60 and 75 years old. And they remain a very powerful group, as I imagine on your tours. Often it is the children of veterans in some capacity who want to know more about their loved one who probably now has passed on. And I think that something has changed. I write in the book about the Canada in the 1960s and 70s, where there's a very strong anti-war movement picking up from the Vietnam War and what was happening in the United States, and Canada having its own variation of that. Canada always having a very strong peacekeeping myth is maybe the word, or legend, or icon. I mean, to the point where if you ask Canadians, they would have thought we have an army of peacekeepers, which we might have, but most guys in the Canadian Forces I talked to always said, well, you have to be a soldier to be a peacekeeper. You need to have proper military training to be a peacekeeper. And all of that in the second half of the 20th century really obscured what we had done in the World War II. In the 21st century, there is a stronger impulse to understand our history, even if it is painful, even if it is dark. I'm not a patriotic historian. It's not hand on your heart, stand behind the flag no matter what. I've written about the Great War, the terrible slaughter in the trenches. And yet there is an incredible resiliency, I find, among these men and women who served, which comes through their letters and their diaries and their memoirs and talking to them, that I think is important to talk about. It's part of our shared history. And if we think in terms here of an international conversation of Britain, United States, and Canada, it's important to remind our allies, who are still our allies in these very uncertain times, that Canada stepped up in World War II. And was an important ally, not on par with the United States and Britain, but yet an important middle power, a second tier, and yet one that contributed mightily to this war that had to have been won, a war that I had called in one book a necessary war.
Yeah, so Tim, I kind of picking up on that. I was going to say, as we get closer towards the end of the hour, for America, World War II is the Great Crusade. We're going to, as our great moment of triumph. For Britain, they've mythologized that period of alone, when Britain stood against fascism, even though they weren't ever alone. For Russia, it's the great...
Oh.
I think Chris is frozen there.
I think Chris has...
For Russia, it's the... Right? Nope. Can you hear me?
You were frozen for a moment, Chris, but you are back.
All right. So we have alone. Then for Russia, it's the Great Patriotic War. So what is it for Canada?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris. And I struggled with that in the book. In fact, that was my defining question at the beginning of the book. It changed when I was writing. And I love the art of writing a book and researching, because you have certain questions you want to answer, and research sometimes answer them, and sometimes it takes you in a whole different place. And what I had acknowledged in other books is that the Great War is the defining moment in Canada. It propels Canada forward towards nationhood. We even talk about in Canada about Vimy, or the Great War itself, being the birth of the nation, because a new country emerged. And you can't be born twice. So what is World War II then? Well, we could have defined it as the war that forever changed us, the war that where Canada stepped up and fought as a significant ally, where Canada produced incredible munitions and war supplies, where 1.1 million Canadians served, where Canada was a part of the great Allied coalition in this necessary war, a war that fundamentally changed Canada, where we became more industrialized, more urbanized, more tied to the United States, with a stronger sense of Canadian identity. All of those things are true, and yet we didn't. And so if the United States saw the war as the war that propels it forward into the 20th century as the great power in the West, and the Cold War that will follow, and the Soviets have their great patriotic war, and Britain is standing alone, and France has its own complicated series of myths around the resistance. What was it in Canada? And you have to conclude that in the first 50 years, it was about defeat and disgrace. And isn't that strange? As I write in the book, we were the only country that embraced this self-loathing, this very strange desire to take a victory and turn it into a defeat. No other country I know did that.
Right.
And the book explores that. And now, luckily, I think that it has changed over the last 25 years, but it really did have an impact on how we, as Canadians, thought about the war, and a damaging one, I think. And I hope that my book, if anything, will not be the last word written on it, although no one has written a book like this in Canada, and there are very few others. I'm sure you guys are very well read. There aren't a lot of books like this that look at the evolving memory of war and all, putting it all together. There will be other people who look at my book from different angles, maybe in French Canada, which is always a different view of the war, maybe through the lens of gender and what women were doing. But I hope that I've created a bit of a foundation here for us to go forward and to explore some of these ideas, and to think about some of these big questions, like what happens when you don't tell your own history? What happens when you create one version of a war that really doesn't encompass the entire complexity of service and sacrifice? What is the role of historians and curators and filmmakers in telling stories? All of these are in my book, and it's really interesting that a lot of people have picked up on these stories, which are not maybe intrinsically linked to military history, but they are part of the way that war shapes, in this case, Canada, but also the echo of war over time, the long shadow of war that we are still in. And I think that the book offers some ways to think about that, not just for Canadians, but I think that there's value probably for Americans or British or others to look at this.
I was going to say, I think that's one of the things that I found fascinating about the book, because I understand that, you know, maybe a lot of Americans aren't as into this Canadian history as obviously you are, or I am personally, but to use your book as a way to see how you treat history and how history is used and history evolves, it's a wonderful lesson in that as well. Right?
Thank you.
And I think that's another great value of the book.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining us. You know, you have the last word on this topic on History Happy Hour. We promise not to book any other guests who talk about this topic. So whether someone else publishes another book, we can't control that. But we'll give you the last word. And we so appreciate your coming on today. And I want to remind people that is it? I'm sorry, I get confused. Is it 12 books or 13 books?
Well, it's 12 big books, but there's an edited book, and then I have about 10 museum catalogs, which I notice that some people count, but we'll just call it 12.
12.
We'll call it 12. So
it's more than you.
Well, it depends on how you count.
You have to do some very creative counting.
You have to do some very creative counting. But the 12th and most recent one is The Fight for History, 75 Years of Forgetting, Remembering, and Remaking Canada's Second World War. I had to lean in to read that one. But thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. I really enjoyed being on your show, and next time I will bring a proper drink.
Well, then he has to come back.
Awesome. Done deal. All right. Cheers.
Take care, Tim. Thank you.
That was good. It's a terrible failure of mine not to have informed him about the happy hour part. Well, it's a failure of yours also, by the way.
Well, but you're the tech department.
Well, you're the communication department.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
Yeah. So I wanna say a couple of things about next week's show. First of all, Chris, it marks a special occasion.
What might that be, Rick?
Next year is the 1 year.
Next year?
Next week is the 1 year anniversary of History Happy Hour. We did our first show on March 20th of 2020. So it was 2020.
But you promised me it was just going to be for a couple weeks.
I, lied.
Well, there you go.
There you go. And so next week will also be our 52nd show. So we did skip 1 week, but it's our 52nd show. It's our 1 year anniversary. Let us know, by the way. Tell us how you think we should celebrate. We have a guest. We're not spending the hour celebrating.
Fear not. It won't be just Rick and I.
But if you have an idea, we have a couple of little ideas. But if you have an idea, you can let us know. We do not promise to use your idea, but we promise to look at it. Okay? And I want to just say about our show next week, let me just pull up the book covers. It's really, really interesting. It is a book called Plunder, a Memoir of Family Property and Nazi Treasure. And the guest is Menachem Kaiser. And I want to read what the New York Times, they called this book enthralling and said, and I thought this was a terrific quote, "It's a weird story that gets weirder."
There you go.
Which also sounds like the last year of History Happy Hour. So what a perfect book for us to deal with.
Get weirder and weirder.
On our 1 year anniversary. So we hope you will join us and that we'll have a big crowd to celebrate. And then the next show will be the first show of year 2. Wow. That's true stuff.
And it's just going to be for a few weeks.
Well, who knows? Who knows how long it will go? All right. Well, anyway, thanks everybody for joining us today.
Everybody.
Appreciate it.
Stay safe.